Hello, everyone. This is Tom Morgan from The Leading Edge. And today I'm talking to Peter Merry. Peter is the co-founder of Ubiquity University and Weird Technologies, author of four books, expert in spiral dynamics. And today we are going to be talking about leadership. In short, we're going to be talking about leadership through the framework of spiral dynamics, but also what this moment is asking of us individually and collectively. The clue is in the name. Leading Edge is very interested in conceptions of leadership, and Peter is one of the world's experts in transformational leadership. So, Peter, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome, Tom. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. So people get really into their developmental maps. There's the Wilber guys, there's the Suzanne Cook-Greuters guys, there's the Claire Graves guys. You're a spiral dynamics guy. Assuming we're not gonna be yet another podcast talking about stages of development, but what I think we need is a relatively quick introduction for people that have no idea what spiral dynamics is and no idea what we're talking about, so we can use as a jumping off point for the rest of the conversation. So if you could do that, that would be great.
Okay.
No.
Right, in a nutshell. Well, I mean, you can go back like civilizationally and see how we have evolved as humans over time from kind of hunter-gatherers into tribes, into feudal empires, into nation states and religions, into market states and economies, into value-driven communities like Leading Edge, and into new forms of collectives that are organizing to kind of functionally have the impact that's needed to be had on the planet at this time. And those phases that I just described not only are the phases that we've gone through collectively as humanity over time, and they are ways that we have learned to cope as the world around us has evolved and changed. But they are also, interestingly enough, the same stages that we all go through individually from the moment we're born. So these phases of development we go through as each individual mirror the phases that we've been through collectively as humanity on our journey. And it's in a way the same way as the fetus goes through the phases of humans' organic development, right, over the years when we kind of it has like a fish-like form and then evolves to look something maybe a bit like a dinosaur with a massive head or although of course we didn't descend from the dinosaurs. But you see the very interesting mirroring between the journey we've been on for hundreds of thousands of years and the journey we go on from the moment we're born. And basically what spiral dynamics is a map of that landscape. And as people would always say, it's important not to confuse the map with the landscape. Any map is a lens to look at the complexity of reality through. And if it helps us find our way, then use it. And if it doesn't, then throw it away. So, Spiral in particular looks at what they call value systems, which are ways of us making sense of the reality around us and coping with it. Basically, that's fundamentally it. And it looks like quite similar to Maslow's pyramid. So Claire Graves, who did the original research, was around the same time as Maslow. The only distinction is Graves said it doesn't stop at the top of a pyramid. It actually keeps going as an open-ended spiral, kind of going from there to more inclusive, because each new stage transcends and includes the previous one, and each new stage creates new problems that a new stage is going to have to solve. So at the end of his lifetime, apparently Maslow agreed with Graves. In fact, it isn't a closed pyramid, it is an ongoing evolving system. So spiral dynamics is a map of those, and I'd say it's worth looking at probably eight of the stages that that it describes, and an octave is generally a kind of good way to look at things because it also has a kind of completion sense to it, which we can come to later if you want. But basically, it starts off with this survival stage where we're just trying to stay alive and we do all we can to stay alive. Hunter-gatherer, originally, the moment that we're born. And then we find out that our ability to survive becomes enhanced if we learn to bond together with others and so have more safety as a collective. So the next value system is safety driven. It's very we focused, so it's focused on the collective. There's very little space for the individual. It was the tribal kind of phase of our collective evolution. And it's funny because I got my little kind of weird light here, and it's just glowing purple, which is the color that Spiral Dynamics gives to that stage of development. So originally there weren't colors. Originally Graves gave them letters to two letters, one to describe the life conditions and one to describe the coping mechanism. So AB was beige and BO is what they then called purple later on. And those first two stages, it's important, I think, to understand for our current context are pre-rational and non-linear and instinctive. So we experienced reality then as cyclical. We weren't sitting around thinking or talking about interconnectedness, but we experienced everything as interconnectedness, very much in our body with our senses very alert to be able to stay alive. And it's only with the emergence of the next stage that we get the sense of separate self. So psychologically, that's the emergence of the ego, the ability to reflect on oneself, and see another, and realize there are separations and distinctions to be made between self and other. So think about that because that is only a recent development. Right? Before then, we experienced ourselves as interconnected, we experienced ourselves as everything as cyclical. So even linear time only starts to emerge then in our collective history with feudal empires and agriculture, right, where we plant things to be able to harvest them later. And it's like the test you can do with your 2 or 3 year old. If you put a sweetie on the table and you're like well, this comes to the stage afterwards. But if you're like you can take it now and have it, or you can kind of wait a few hours and come back later. If they wait a few hours, you know that the complexity of thinking is higher than if they just instinctively take it. Because when they come back, yeah, of course, I have to say there's a reward. If they come back later, there are two sweets rather than just the one. Whereas this egocentric, power-driven system that emerges with the first sense of separate self would take the sweet and eat it. It's like now. It's very much in the present, dealing with a world that's dangerous, and you're needing to act instinctively and impulsively now. And the strongest is the one that survives. So in our culture, it's the kind of street gang culture. It's that very much the strongest is the boss, basically. Um, and that is what happened was that we suddenly, as we become aware of ourselves, we became aware of ourselves and nature. Nature as something separate to us. And so being aware of it, we needed to try to survive in it and control it. Now, in a healthy development, what would happen is that you would push away from those first two stages to create the space for the separate sense of self to emerge, but then you would wrap back in the previous stages of development. So psychologically, each time we move stages in a healthy way, we transcend and include. If we transcend and repress, you create a pathology. So what you do is you push off the past into your shadow, and it'll do everything it can to sabotage you until you recognize it, bring it into the light, and reintegrate it. And what happened in Western civilization, unfortunately, is that as this sense of separate self emerged, we couldn't hold the previous value systems and wrap them in, and we transcended and repressed them. So if you think about what that means that we repressed our sense of interconnectedness, our instinctive sense of belonging and safety. We repressed our sense of relationship to the earth, anything that was to do with the feminine, the emotional side, and the body, as we surged, out of that and attempted to assert ourselves as separate beings. In a healthy way, we would have had that distinction, but maintained that sense of interconnectedness, right? And because that was the path that happened in Western civilization, that has basically determined the rest of our evolution since then. So if you imagine this sense of separate self coming out, very much an I-driven system wanting to power over things. The natural swing that you see in spiral dynamics, but not in all of the developmental models, is from an I to a we, or you could say from a yin to a yang and back again. It's like a pendulum. And so when the I pushes far, as it does with this ego sense of separate self system in the red, as they call it, in spiral dynamics, as they label it. The next is what emerges is a collective system to try to set the rules by which all these power-driven individuals can play, because you realize that it's only if there's a set of rules can you actually live together, or else it's just a Wild West. So if you're wanting to build some kind of collective civilization, you have to build a set of rules that everyone's going to play by. Now, that is the fourth value system, the order-driven one. And in order for people to play by rules like that, they have to have a sense of higher purpose. Like, why should I do this? Why should I listen to the priest? Well, you listen to the priest because if you don't, you go to hell. If you do, you go to heaven, right? You listen to the king, so if you don't, you get your head cut off. So it's a very clear kind of reward, punishment, know your place, order in the hierarchy. And in its beauty, it really helps you to relax because you know your place. You know, if you do this, that will happen. And if you do that, that will happen. Follow the rules, do what the boss says, easy life. Unless, of course, you don't agree with the rules or the boss, in which case you have a very difficult life. So that was that kind of blue system that emerged. And in the individual, that's the moment that you can postpone your desire for pleasure now and wait until later. So that's the child who can say, actually, I'll come back in an hour and get 2 sweets. That's the reward. That's the go to heaven, right? So then you know that they've developed that blue complexity, that ability to postpone their impulse. But when you've got a wild red system, because it's unrooted in that beige purple instinctive sense of belonging to earth and the feminine and the body, then you need an over controlling and oppressive blue, right, to be able to hold it down. So you can see that very fundamental split that happened when we didn't transcend and include the instinctive sense of belonging in beige purple, but transcended and repressed, means that you've had this wilder red that's unrooted and therefore needed an over controlling blue system on top of it. So the natural code in these systems are healthy in themselves, but if you get a distortion in it, then you obviously get over controlling or over wild, say in the red. So that blue system is very much a we system. Obviously, it's trying to bound you into the rules and the system, know your place, channel that red energy into a kingdom or a religion or whatever it is. Of course, the swing now happens back to the I, where the individual feels they need to assert their own identity again. So this is the evolution of the kind of, it was in our collective history, it was our ability to analyze and see things, the rational mind, to think about things, to step back and look at it. And why believe the priest, right? When actually, if I look through my telescope or my microscope, I can see the world myself. And so I actually see that the Earth isn't at the center of the universe, but it seems to revolve around the sun. Well, if you say that too early, you're going to get burned at the stake, because it's challenging that old blue system, which was a faith-based system. It wasn't a rational system. So you get this emergence of the rational mind and this drive for knowledge and this drive to be better at what we're doing and improve everything. And the liberation of the individual, really, I mean, it's what the United States was built on originally, was the freedom of the individual to be a self-made man. This was the thing. You take responsibility, you go out and do it, and you can be whoever you want. That's the kind of American dream. And it came out of very much this strong orange strive drive system, as we called it. Now, remember that what has happened in the Western civilization and been exported to the rest of the world is that this orange strive drive system has been built on a rootless system because we don't have that beige purple. And when you do that, when you unleash the creativity of science and our ability to look at things, exploit nature, get better and better and get more and more, and it's not held in a instinctive sense of connectedness to nature, then you get what we've got, which is a massive exploitation of all other forms of life on the planet for our own individual progress and a complete forgetting of the interconnectedness that we're a part of. So that healthy orange system is the exploration, the drive to be the best that we can at things, which in itself is positive. But collectively, that's really what's brought us to the brink of extinction at the moment, because it's not because we've had that separation from the kind of pre-rational sense of just being. Um, so that's a very much individualistic system, as I'm sure you got a sense of. And what happens then is we're kind of, oh, I'm feeling lonely again. Give me people, give me the collective again. So it swings back to the next level of complexity where where you kind of achieved all you can. You've got everything, however many houses, boats, bank accounts, whatever. Even if you've just achieved your goals and your dreams, and you're kind of, and I'm still not happy. So this must be something else. And then you turn inside and discover the world of your emotions, your inner reality. You start to care not just about people's status, but how they feel. You care about harmony and belonging. You start to wake up to what it is we've done to the earth and the suffering of other beings on the planet. And you develop a sensitivity to self and a sensitivity to the rest of life around us. And that we probably saw emerging kind of first most strongly in the kind of movement of the 60s, I'd say, in the whole hippie movement, which was a combination of the individual freedom as well as this kind of sensitivity side. And that has come out through in the postmodern worldview, which says every individual is their own individual. They have a right to be who they are, and nobody can tell anybody else what they should do because everyone has their own truth. So it's the complete relativization of everything, which has its own beauty to it because it honors the diversity that's out there, honors people for who they are, but in its corrupt form, when it can't rest as it would in that kind of pre-rational just sense of belonging, it then pushes that further and can't draw useful distinctions developmentally between where people are on their journey. So it believes that not only is everybody equal, but everyone's the same. And everybody should be able to see things the way that they can see things. So doesn't forget the journey that they've been on themselves to get to this kind of postmodern sensitive self space. And in that sense, expects to be able to sit round the table with folks with a highly strong red system and just talk it out. Well, that's not going to happen. You
Mm.
know, they're going to do what they can to manipulate this nice little bubble you've created for their own ends. And green, this sensitive stuff, doesn't know how to deal with that because it doesn't want to judge or draw boundaries or draw lines. So how many, of your listeners have sat in circles, very well intentioned, and tried to make a decision, that includes everybody and never gets anywhere because people are only interested in how everybody feels and is everybody included? And so the directionality has gone. It's all become kind of insular and focused. So that is where Green wakes up to, my God, the state of the world. There's a lot of pain and suffering out there, but can't do anything about it because it doesn't have that actionable energy to it to be able to make something happen. It's just making sure everybody's feeling included. And so those are the conditions for the seventh system, what they call the integral system, to emerge, which is a swing back to the individual, but much more subtly in the sense that it's including an awareness of the collective and has this context of the green sensitivity, but realizes, holy moly, things are going down the plug hole, the lemmings are running off the cliff. We need to do something now to solve these problems. And it gets kind of in its first phase is irritated with Green's lack of action and wants to kind of just get focused and get stuff done, but for the good of the whole. So the ego kind of takes a much more of a background role here. It's put in place in service of the major challenges that we're facing as humanity, basically. So that's the yellow integral self. And for the first time, is able to take some distance from its own identity. So, whereas up until now, in each of the value systems, we've identified very much with that value system and find it hard to honor or recognize the others. Yellow, for this integral self, for the first time, can see itself and its own developmental journey and honors those and realizes that it is a journey. Everyone is on their own journey. It's not one is not better than the other. But what we need to do is make sure that each value system and each person with a certain value system is able to express themselves in a healthy way and contribute to the various challenges that we're facing in the world. So it's kind of what Don Beck would call a spiral wizard, who will go up and down the value systems, creating the habitats and the ways for different people to express themselves constructively, to do what needs to be done. Don's favorite quote is no more prizes for predicting the rain, which is what green tends to do a lot of. Only prizes for building the arcs.
Yeah.
So that's very much the yellow thing. And then the eighth stage is where you see yellow is still, and Don would often talk about it in terms of engineering. It's like, how do we put all these parts together to make a big whole and with a W and solve all the problems that we're facing? And at some point, in your attempt to do that, you reach the limits of your cognitive capacity. The complexity you realize is just way too big for us to even map in systems thinking in terms of being able to see the whole system or think that we can, if we understand, if we do this, that will happen there. There's just so much complexity, the rational mind can't grok it. And at that point, there's a very interesting moment of surrender and a realization that the whole is way bigger than the parts, and we will never be able to rationally understand the whole of the whole. So we need to have a different way of knowing. We need to develop a different way of knowing, and it's not the rational mind. And so that's where, interestingly, it switches back to the kind of beige purple context of interconnectedness, but this time trans-rational experience of interconnectedness. So an awareness of everything that the previous value systems has given, but also an understanding that we can't deal with this through the rational linear consciousness that we've developed up until now. That there has to be another form of knowing that is ultimately more intuitive, more right brain, a sense of the whole that informs the mind to act, but is led from that kind of more heart-based, intuitive sense of what's happening. And as I say, with that comes a big surrender, because if you can't understand it all, you can't plan. So the whole idea of like a big plan that we're going to kind of roll out and control as we move forward, predict and control model, that all goes out the window. And you realize all you can do is take the next natural step and then sense, and then take the step after that, and then sense again. And then, so it's really a practice of pre-sensing, quite literally, like you're pre-sensing what's coming in. That's presencing, right? That's informing what you do next. And then you do the next thing, and then you let go of your attachment to what the outcome of that action is going to be. And then you pay attention to what actually happens, and you pre-sense, presence yourself again, and then take the next step. That's a practice as individuals, as leaders, but it's also a practice for organizations. And it's kind of expressed itself in agile governance. Really but I describe it as the presencing of a system. How do you keep an organization as close to the present moment as possible? And in that sensing, acting mode, rather than kind of attached to something in the future that the moment you take the next step is out of date anyway. So that expresses itself, that turquoise holistic value system, through an experience of the world being an interconnected web of energy, energy and information. That's all flows across, that matter is just one particular expression, dense expression of energy and information, but that spectrum expands out into our thoughts and emotions that, of course, we can't see, but we do know are there, out into more subtle fields of energy, out of which the manifest world emerges. So with consciousness being primary, those fields of information are the fields that hold the probabilities of a certain future. And you learn to work with those fields to increase the probability of a certain future manifesting in the knowledge that you have no control
Hmm.
and you cannot guarantee that it's going to work out that way. So there's a kind of release of attachment and there's a kind of playful curiosity that emerges in the process. And that becomes, and this isn't out of context, but that becomes the way to cope with a massively fast-moving, highly complex world. And when you realize that you can't control it all rationally, and you drop into that state of presence, then all the synchronicities start to happen, and you get into a flow state, and all things start to show up in a way that you could never have known or predicted in advance, but turn out to be highly effective. So it becomes the most effective way to navigate a highly complex world is through a much simpler state of being,
Hmm.
ironically. There you go. Probably wasn't as short as you wanted, but
No, it was beautiful and perfect and exactly what I was after. As I shared with you yesterday, so you gave a great presentation for us privately for Leading Edge, and it exploded a few of my preconceptions. And I thought about how I would articulate it in the form of a metaphor. And the best I could come up with is, people love to think of these things as hierarchies that you climb. And to your point, they're not, they're holarchies. You contain all of these ingredients. You don't skip a stage, which allows you to be much more compassionate about your college atheist stage or your overachiever stage or your, when you loved whichever rationalist thinker that you loved. So like we all contain those things, but what you also told me is that it's very much related to your situation. That, if you're in excellent soil, you have the ability, not the guarantee, but you have the ability to grow to the much more subtle levels. And they are defined by subtlety, that each level things becoming increasingly obvious at an energetic level. And what I was realizing, and I want you to pick me up if this is right, is that essentially we're these growing onions, but there's this moment in our development where we realize we're not only the growing onions, we're the thing that's making it grow. We start to understand the nature of consciousness itself. And so the role of leadership within that is not just to help other people grow, but it's to create the conditions. It's to basically a leader as a gardener, where they understand that there's an emergent force that's helping everyone grow, and to work with that. It's very different from other forms of leadership. Does that resonate with what you think?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what emerges really at Turquoise. And a couple of things to say there. Firstly, when I was in the kind of, I think, third level training with Don, I said to him, so Don, it seems to me that spiral dynamics is an expression of yellow integral thinking. He was like, yeah, because it's like, how do you take all these parts and stitch them together and stuff like that? And I was okay, so I guess that means that by your own theory, once we get beyond yellow, spiral dynamics is no longer an adequate way of understanding reality because the complexity has increased, right? And spiral dynamics is coming out of yellow. And he paused and he said, Mary, I like the way you think. And that was it. But that's really, really important because it means, as we push into turquoise and these kind of post really transrational stages, that understanding things as stages in this way is no longer an adequate way, meaning an encompassing enough way of understanding our reality. So what you started to describe just now is a better way of, or I'd say a more adequate way from that perspective of understanding and engaging reality. So my third book was called Leading from the Field, which was exactly that, a set of 12 principles for how to curate the conditions energetically for a system to thrive. So if we can accept that everything with a name and a boundary has an energy and information field, right? It has its material expression, but the like the light spectrum, it just stretches into the subtle. So it has its own field as well. And you can actually work consciously with the energetic information fields of anything with a name and a boundary. So an organization, piece of land, whatever, then if you can accept that, then as a leader, how do you curate the information and energy field of the system that you're accountable for, you're the gardener of in your language, or in our language, you're the steward of? Stewardship, guardianship, gardener, chief gardener, that kind of chief gardening officer, that kind of thing. Um, because what I found, and so I did a lot, spent a lot of time in organizational development and leadership work and did a lot with the very early days of Theory U and all of that stuff. And that's really all about relationship. All of that stuff's about relationship, which is a big step forward than just the material. But once you start to work with the energetics, then the relationships start to look after themselves, stuff starts to heal itself, things self-organize, and the material starts to manifest much more gracefully. So I see kind of, I would never do any more leadership organizational work without doing the energetic work at the same time, because it's just a waste of time, basically. And everything kind of accelerates and the synchronicities come into play. And so, yeah, it's a very different form of leadership because although you have a clear intention for something, you realize that you will never know how that intention is going to manifest. And so you then come back to the present moment and you pay attention moment to moment for how things are starting to come your way to enable that vision that you're holding to manifest itself. You also realize that you can't claim ownership of it because it's very much something that comes through you or is guided or curated by you rather than something that you make happen. In fact, it's one of the conditions. And so with the weird technologies, which are these consciousness interactive technologies we've been working with, you find that if you try to make the light, for example, change color, it doesn't work. So there's the linear causal thinking and approach doesn't honor the quality of presence and connectedness needed to be able to co-create with the field of consciousness. It's when you drop into a kind of playful, experimental, entangled relationship with your light or or with your organization or with reality as you're leading your organization, that you'll find consciousness starts to work with you because you've reconnected, you've like plugged back in to the field and you recognize that you're just a part of this highly complex field of life emerging that there's no way you can control. You can just put in place certain conditions and be clear on the general direction you want to go, and then help the pieces form around that general pathway forward.
What would be an example that you've seen or that you could think of someone working within a traditional business structure in that form of leadership?
I have to think if I ever even know anybody who's worked in that way. What I can say is I set up something called the Center for Human Emergence here in the Netherlands. That was an experiment really in how to run an organization in an integral way. And we were doing this massive multi-stakeholder, complex problem-solving projects for the Dutch government. And at some point realized that we hit the yellow threshold. So we realized it was way too complex. And so what we did is we ended up calling a turquoise research project. So it was a project into what are the practices that enable one to lead in this kind of way, and how do they work and how do they show up and things. So and created a whole report on it actually that I think is on my blog somewhere. It was quite a lot. It was like 10 years ago, maybe even 7, 8. Anyway, quite a long time ago. And that gave us pointers. And so there have been a lot, I'd say a lot of smaller initiatives that you see coming up where people are leading more in that way. But I've not seen any leader really in any of the kind of mainstream, well, maybe that says it, right? Any of the mainstream organizations leading in that way. Because I think it's also the whole habitat that you're embedded in. If you haven't structured your organization in a different way, kind of sucks you into that paradigm, sucks you into that other paradigm. What we're trying to do with Weird as an organization, what we are doing is creating a form that will honor, that thinks of the organization as an organism in an ecology and understands that in an ecology, for the organism to thrive, the whole ecology has to thrive. And financial capital is one resource in that ecology, but your partners, your staff, the natural resources you're using, your partners, suppliers, clients, they're all part of this ecology. And so in the what we're calling the Weird Commons model, all of those players get honored through dividends, through capital gains, through voting rights in the organization as a whole. So what this approach does, it lifts the ecology as a whole in an understanding that the organism will only thrive if the ecology thrives. And it honors the interconnectedness that's already there, rather than just saying, oh, the only thing that counts is the financial capital, financial return. So I think that kind of model, which people are experimenting with. So there's quite a few steward owned organizations. I was at an event in London hosted by the Rowntree Foundation recently, looking at this whole stewardship model. And then you look at people like Patagonia or Bosch, right? Some of this kind of family-owned companies. It's John Lewis in the UK, all of whom have a model that in some way is much more steward and purpose and mission driven than purely financial driven. But you certainly don't hear much about a kind of leadership that consciously integrates the energetic dimension of things. However, some of these people might be doing it and just not telling people, which would be, quite understandable. Yeah.
Yeah, there's the old Chinese adage that they don't build statues to generals because if anyone knows who you are, you weren't a very good general because you should have won already. All right.
Right.
Like people don't know who the sages are because they're sages. On the other hand, I feel like anyone listening to this who's of a certain kind of person, which is probably everyone listening to this, they're going to be thinking to themselves, "Well, how do I move up the stages? How do I know what stage I am? How do I start to look at turquoise and yellow? And how do I bring on those traits? How do you
Mm.
think about that in terms of like deliberately evolving your consciousness through stages?"
Mm. Well, first of all, the desire to get to the top of the spiral.
I know what you're going to say.
Beyond turquoise, it's like people look at it and some people are talking about coral beyond. I think I might have a bit of coral. Kind of, dude. That's the orange.
Hmm.
That's strive, drive. I want to get to the top of the spiral. Once you're beyond that, the question is, how can I be of greatest service? And you're not worried about getting up the spiral. So, but the best way to naturally evolve, should the life conditions require it, right? So there's no point in trying to push yourself to a new level if your life conditions are requiring if you're being really successful at being of service where you are now. Like let's take my father-in-law, for example, who's kind of got a really beautiful blue and has been of great service to his church community, plays in a police band, all these kind of things. And you couldn't look for someone, he's been kind of awarded various medals of service and everything else, is making a fantastic contribution to the community. Right, beautiful blue. The last thing you want him doing is kind of, moving up the spiral that way because he's got life conditions that he's able to create a good fit with and be of service on. Now, having said that, if you put him in a context of the high complexity of the kind of world that we're in, and he had to deal with all of these challenging issues, he wouldn't have that ability to do so. So you are going to need people who have the capacity to see the complexity in the system as a whole and engage with it constructively. But a part of engaging with it constructively is the understanding that not everybody needs to be able to do that. Right? What you need to do, if you can understand what the functions are that need to be performed. Let's take a very concrete example in an organization. It could be accounting, marketing, HR, right? There are also societal functions like your fire brigade or your army or your business sector or your caring sector, right? Those are different functions we need to perform, and they are all served best by different value systems. So you want a really healthy blue, order-driven, transparent accounting department, right? You don't want an orange or a green, slightly fluffy accounting department, right? Ching, ching, ching. It's got to be clear and transparent. You want a kind of a goal-driven marketing department that's really after, achieving results, beautifully supported by orange. You want a people-driven, sensitive HR department, beautifully held by green. So what the kind of integral leadership does is it understands there are various functions in our societies and organizations that are best supported by different value systems. And it builds the habitats to support people who have a strong fit with that value system to perform those tasks. So it does not try to push people anywhere. It's trying to create fit between who we are and the function we have to perform in the context. And then the best way to help somebody evolve is to feed them lots of where they are now. So if they're kind of blue order structure, give them all the rules, all the order structure, all everything else until some point they're saturated. And then by themselves, they'll go, no, actually, why should I actually? No, I'm actually starting to question some of your kind of, and you're kind of, oh, a waking orange,
Mm.
right? And then there's a need for the individual to kind of find their space outside of the bureaucracy, basically. And that will happen naturally if the life conditions are requiring or if the person has the capacity to make that step. In terms of like if people are feeling that the complexity of the world around them is way too much for them to cope with, and so I'm going to go for a spiral profile of kind of orange green. So we always have at least two, warm color and cool color, an I and we balance. So let's say, there's an orange with a good, we've opened up to the sensitivity. We're feeling the pain of the world. We realize how important it is to respect everybody. And we're feeling completely powerless because we see no way we can deal with all this mess. Those are the conditions for the emergence of yellow turquoise. And the first step, I would say, is because remember what happens is we at that point we're able to step away from our attachment to ourselves and to our beliefs and to our judgments about others and things around us. And the best way to do that is to learn a meditation practice, a basic mindfulness practice where you just sit there and you notice all these thoughts and all these judgments and all this other stuff. Because the moment that you do that, you're not the thought and the judgment, right? You're kind of having an experience of yourself being something other than the mind and all its chatter. And that sounds very simple, but it's a very fundamental shift because the moment that you can make that shift, you can just stay sitting there while all the stuff is going on. And that translates into not just all the stuff in my head, but all the stuff in the world. And you don't lose yourself, big S. You don't lose your center. You can see all the stuff going on. You can make discernments and judgments, and you don't get caught up in it. It's like sitting in the eye of the tornado, right? Something if you reach out and try to grab it, you're sucked into it and into the drama of it all and everything else. But if you can sit in the center, then you can see the tornado, and maybe you can notice, like, okay, the patterns that start to emerge in it all and where the potential intervention points are. Let me try that out and see what happens. Because you're starting to move beyond your attachment to yourself and and to the world around you, you can experiment with things and not get upset when it doesn't work out the way you thought it might work out. You say, oh, that's interesting. That's a piece of information. It's not a judgment anymore. So judgment radically changes, in fact, falls away in that journey into what in spiral dynamics they call the second tier, the integral and the holistic self. So that's, I'd say, for anybody looking to do that, that's the first step. But then what you'll find, then the fun begins, right? Because then what you'll find is all the shit starts to show itself to you. Everything that you've buried, that you've ignored, all the pain cause to yourself and everybody else. You kind of, oh, I've learned to sit here and, oh, oh shit, oh yeah, I've forgotten about that. Because, you've taken that space that stuff can just start to show itself and emerge. And so then you have to deal with what we would call your shadow. So all this stuff appears out of your shadow because that stuff is the stuff. Remember, we talked about transcend and include and transcend and repress. That's the stuff you transcended and repressed that is holding the energy you need to take the next step. So it's kind of coming in and saying, okay, you need to integrate me now. And you're kind of, shit, I need to deal with this thing that I thought I'd kind of buried really deep. And so often you can't do that by yourself. So you're going to need a therapist or somebody to be your mirror and to coach you through that integration process. So it isn't a getting rid of something. This is the point. It's you've split something off that is actually you. And so the work is to honor it, see it, the role that it's played on your journey, and allow it to be there and allow it to find its way to settle into your system rather than kind of be split off. And subconsciously, you're fighting it the whole time, right? When it's in your shadow, you're trying to keep it down because you're fearful of the moment it comes back and raises its ugly head. You're going to say something stupid, So you kind of keep it down there. So the moment you take that step, you start to do your mindfulness or whatever, your thing that allows yourself to take some distance, all the shit comes up. And then you've got to do that reintegration work. And as you do that, you'll also start to notice that you become conscious of energies moving in your body. So that thing that you split off, for example, as you try to bring it in, you'll notice it moves somehow in your body. You start to kind of feel it physically in your body. And so you become conscious of, wow, there's this energy stuff in my body, and realizing that, you can actually start to feel that energy, between your hands. So there's an awakening to the energetic dimension. So you're just expanding your bandwidth really beyond your physical material self, to realizing there's this, okay, and so there's this extension of myself that is energy and information. Okay. So all of that then starts to unpack itself. And then of course you want to work out, okay, energy and information in the world. Okay, how does that work? And so this whole exploration into I'd say consciousness is really what happens then. And everything that I've described so far kind of comes into play. And it's it's not, as many people I think in the leading edge community as well, going on this journey. It's not an easy journey. It's full of pain and suffering and everything else, but the release and relief that comes, when you're not having to subconsciously fight your shadow the whole time, is huge. And suddenly all the kind of stress drops away. You can just, be yourself in all your perfect imperfection. And then synchronicities start to happen, flow starts to happen, things start to show up. All the thought that you had to try so hard, you need to stop trying.
Mm.
When you stop trying, it starts to happen. And we continually, of course, get caught up in this. We'll just kind of stop trying. Yeah. And then it tends to happen. Stop struggling. I was looking for a word. It was something a teacher gave me once. I had it as a postcard on my wall for a long time. I was just stop struggling. Because on my back, I've been like an activist, like eco-activist, change the world, this kind of stuff. Planting trees on motorways and preventing roads being built and all that kind of thing. So I had a very strong struggle energy. And but stopping struggling, it's a pretty powerful step. Yeah.
I had a really big penny drop moment for me in researching this, which is probably like blindingly obvious, but I've encountered all these stories of near-death experiences. My last guest, the leading edge, she effectively died rafting in Ecuador, Emily Lane, and she said that it basically freed her from a matter-bound consciousness state, and it led to this gradual awakening process of her own intuitive powers and gifts. But you see this all the time. And then you also realize that in shamanic cultures, but also in a lot of the mystical cultures, an outer body experience was the initiatory transformation moment. And I was like, oh, okay. It's suddenly the moment when you stop identifying with, the rainbow onion that you are, and you suddenly start looking at yourself as the rainbow onion and the force that is making it grow. And
Mm.
and that obviously that shift comes with a huge existential crisis potential, because you're like, oh my God, I'm not all these things and I am all these things, and what am I doing with my life? But it was
Mm.
this, I think it's this understanding that whatever you want to call it, consciousness is primary, or everything is consciousness, or that transition point from what they would call tier one to tier two seems to be the more dramatic moment. But it also seems that that is what's happening on the fringes of culture right now, and at an accelerating rate, as you said. Do you believe that's happening?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you can see it through the kind of upsurge in psychedelics and how people are being really kind of explicit about that now, which again, all of these things, be it, and I don't want to belittle them, but be an out-of-body experience, a near-death experience, a psychedelics experience, breath work out of, takes you out of your body experience, whatever, all of these things, they're basically giving you state experiences. They're getting you out of the gross into the subtle, potentially into the causal state of consciousness. Now, we all have access to those states of consciousness anytime if we want, because we live them every day. We have a waking consciousness, we have a dreaming consciousness, and we have a deep sleep consciousness. So we have those states and we shift through them in our 24-hour cycle. The opportunity is to be able to consciously navigate those states. So when you have a conscious experience of going into the subtle states, yeah, then it radically shifts something. But the key to remember in that is that that's not the same as a stage development. So you can have a state experience at any stage of development. So if you were, let's say, in blue and you were particularly Christian in a blue context and you had a subtle state experience, you'd probably say you'd seen Jesus, and that would be your stage interpretation of your state experience. Or if you were an orange and you were really in that strive drive, you might even go as far as like, I'm the next guru. I've seen the light. Everybody follow me.
Yeah.
That's kind of orange interpretation of that state experience. So I like the way you framed it with Emily, because she said she had this out of body experience, near death experience, and then there was a gradual unfolding. Now that's how it works. So we have this state experience, it can give us a context, but then you've still got to do your stage work. You've still got to do your shadow work. You've still got to do the developmental work. But you've got a context for it that somehow makes it easier, right? Because you've seen a much bigger picture. So you're less attached and it's much less of a drama. But we do need to be conscious of the fact that stages define the way people show up in their everyday interactions, right? And you've got, we've seen how many gurus have we seen who've had a state, enlightenment, and they try to communicate that to everyone. And you look at their behavior and you're like, this person's not enlightened. Their moral line of development, or their relational line of development, is still ethnocentric or something. It's still egocentric. There's no world centrism, there's no cosmic centrism in that behavior. So that's why it's really important to make that distinction between states and stages. Because sometimes when we get a state experience, we think we're done. I'm enlightened. I've done it, you know, and all the shadow and everything else, you think you could now, go out there and be the next Dalai Lama or whatever. So yeah, just to make that point that that is a very important distinction to make. But I do believe increasingly, at the moment, people are getting those more and more of those state experiences, and they're hearing about them as well. If you look at the telepathy tapes, millions of people listening to those. Joe Rogan jumped on the bandwagon and had Tom Campbell and Hal Puthoff on. Millions of people watch it the first day. And even the UAP disclosure stuff in the US, where all these people are testifying before Congress saying, yes, we have craft, alien craft, and they're driven by consciousness. And no, you can't reverse engineer it. Like, okay, so the question now is not so much is the evidence there for this dimension of reality, but it's are you willing to accept it? And that's the thing. So there was this beautiful quote from Bob Jahn, who was the dean of the School of Engineering, did all the Princeton work at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab. 28 years, basically shown our inner states affect the world around us. And he tells the story of a inverted commas scientist who comes up to him and says, Professor Jahn, even if what you're saying is true, I wouldn't believe it. And you go, well, you know, that one, that's not a scientist, but two, that's the issue. So we know, it's a classic marketing adoption curve. It's the laggards don't even bother. Just find the innovators and early adopters, the people who get it, and build the behaviors, the organizations, the cultures that reflect that perspective, and get on and do it with those people. Don't worry about the people, the critics or the skeptics. Do their own thing. They might change, they might never change, but don't waste energy on it. Do be open-minded, of course, to constructive criticism. I mean, that's, it's not like, oh, he's just a skeptic. No, if it's intelligent feedback, then listen to it. But yeah, we just need to go ahead and, like Don says, build the arcs. I think Leading Edge is one of those arcs.
Oh, thank you. I'm trying. I mean, I think it's quite easy to be compassionate about people that are resisting um, this process because of that shadow ego death that people have to undergo. That like it's not always willful ignorance. It's that it's the ontological shock and the difficulty of that transition is massive. And you can see it within a stage's perspective that people just like kind of aren't quite ready for it. But then when you're thinking about, you've written a lot about this and talked a lot about this, when you're thinking about, all right, let's just get on with it. Let's just look at what, yellow and turquoise organizations would look like to people that are listening to this. I'm more bullish on this concept of walled gardens than I've been in anything in my entire life. That you have these Dunbar-like communities that create the conditions for emergence in the way that ideally a turquoise organization would. And they're going to get it wrong, like horribly, horribly wrong all over the place. But it does seem to me as a way of seeding this next stage of culture. Like, what do you think it should look like? What tips would you give people?
Well, first of all, I think the best metaphor to describe that, and I think you're absolutely right, is the one like way back in 2003 I wrote about in Evolutionary Leadership, which is the caterpillar to butterfly thing. So the caterpillar stuffs itself and gorges itself and then wraps itself up in its cocoon. And then what happens is that these new cells emerge in the body of the caterpillar that biologists call imaginal cells, because they're the cells that contain the information about the butterfly. And what happens is those in the body of the caterpillar, those imaginal cells start to emerge. And then first thing that happens is they get attacked by the immune system of the caterpillar because it believes they're an alien body, alien form. And it's only but they keep emerging, and it's only when the imaginal cells connect that the caterpillar surrenders, the body of the caterpillar dissolves, becomes the food for the butterfly, and those imaginal cells create the future form, which is the butterfly, that then has to build its strength by fighting against the cocoon, by battling with its wings against the cocoon. And then when it's strong enough, then it's released to fly. So I think what we need to do is, what we're doing is we're creating imaginal cells. At one level, you're creating a space for individual imaginal cells to connect up within this cocoon of the leading edge. But also there are many of these walled gardens, so they themselves are their own imaginal cells. We're kind of creating protected environments to prototype our thinking, our feeling, our models. I mean, I've had great feedback from within the leading edge community on the model for the weird. 3 of the members are going to be on our advisory board. It's fantastic. And so it's these spaces that enable us to find the souls who are, in the same explorations. We're in the same journey. But as you say, mistakes will be made, but mistakes should be just seen as learning moments. It's information for the system. It's being experimental, being curious, daring to try something. What's the smallest next step we can take to get the data we need to take the step afterwards? That's all we need to worry about. Nothing else. What's the next natural step?
So powerful. Yeah, I mean, tell us a little bit about Weird Technologies and how it came about.
Well, I mean, basically what we have, and it was of course a bunch of synchronicities that led us to it, is an interface between fluctuations in the field of consciousness and electronic output. So it kind of sits on the veil between the subtle and the gross world and picks up fluctuations and then turns them into experiences for people. It came out of this work at Princeton, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, where they looked at, first of all, why pilots who were getting stressed, fighter pilots in the cockpit, seemed to be influencing the instruments on the dashboard. This is like late 1970s. One of the aircraft companies pointed this out. And so it was the aircraft company actually funded a lot of the initial work at the Princeton lab to try to work out, well, how can the inner state of this pilot be affecting these instruments? And there's no physical explanation or engineering explanation for that, how that could happen. Hence, Princeton Engineering Anomalies research, stuff that didn't fit the model. So they basically built a whole bunch of mechanical devices and digital technology using random event generators that are quantum tunneling processes, generating lots of ones and zeros very, very fast, creating 50% ones and zeros if it was all random, and creating interfaces for people to try to affect those ones and zeros. And they found, yeah, with the use of an intention, you can create more ones or more zeros than should be statistically possible. And that people, when they have a collective shared experience, also affect what should be the random data. And they did all sorts of different experiments over the 28 years. And when they closed the lab in 2007, if you like did a meta study statistically of everything that they'd done, basically they'd proven up to nearly 1 in a billion that what they found, against chance. So they essentially statistically proven that your inner state affects the world around you. I got to know Brenda Dunn, who was a psychologist at the lab, and they'd set up something called the International Consciousness Research Labs for when PEAR closed. And so I got to know Brenda and her son Jeff, who now runs ICRL, and was chatting with Brenda one day, and she's like, "We've got all this stuff. It's sitting here in storage, gathering dust. Can you do anything with it?" And it was one of those kind of magic moments. And I just met a guy in the north of England who has an estate, 3,000 acres, wanting to make it a place of transformation. So I said, been in his family for 1,000 years. I was like, why don't we kind of ship all this stuff across the Atlantic and create an experience center for people to come in and experience their body minds affecting these technologies, with the mission being to remind them of their interconnectedness, to kind of short circuit the rational kind of sense of separation, basically. And luckily, Roger and his wife Paris agreed, and we shipped all the Princeton stuff, library, research, documents, data, orange 1970s sofa, cuddly toys, the whole thing across an established weird experience, like weird with a Y, because that's the original Anglo-Saxon Norse term for the interconnected web that generates all life. So it means to spin. It's what the torus does, that kind of manifestation process. It became the word werden in German, which means to become. So it's literally, it was a description of the manifestation process out of the subtle into the material world, and only got corrupted later to mean strange, to mean weird, as in strange. So we decided we need to reawaken that meme, and which we're in the process of doing. So we created Weird Experience, and then built on the Princeton research to use two REGs, random event generators, and look at correlations between them, to create a research device that you can have in a space, and it'll basically reflect back the field of consciousness. So what's happening in the field based on related to what's going on in the room. So we've done all sorts of different pieces of research. One of the most interesting was when Sadhguru at Harvard Medical School actually took it to Sadhguru's space in Tennessee, where he was doing a consecration event. and you can literally see the moment that he comes into the room, there's a massive peak in the data. So that individual's effect on the field of consciousness, is there in the data. So you see all sorts of things. And what it's starting to teach us is how to design events, meetings, anything where people gather in such a way that you are actually affecting the field of consciousness, that you're actually integrating into the field of consciousness. And so there are design principles, that we're crystallizing out of that for events. And a lot of it goes back to basic kind of ritual structure. Make sure there's a conscious opening, there's a shared purpose, people know why they're there. It's not just head, but it's also heart. That the ending is clearly marketed, like that it's a bounded system, basically. And then we developed a light that responds to your intention and the field around you. Because we wanted something that could go into households and go on meeting room tables and be giving us feedback the whole time that we are connected to this field of consciousness. And when I have a certain experience or a bright idea and the light suddenly glows bright as well, I'm kind of, okay, so that's resonating with something beyond just me, or maybe I think up something and I look at the light and it kind of doesn't do anything. I'm kind of, all right. So it's kind of coaching us in presence, really, because the more present we become, the more connected we become to the field. And as I said before, any linearity that creeps in, like a trying to make it change color or anything else, doesn't work. All you can do is entangle yourself and start to be playful with it, and then you'll notice it kind of plays with you like it's playing with me right now.
Uh-huh. I had one on my desk too, and it just changed color as you said, change color.
Oh,
So
there you go. Those kind of things happen, and they just kind of bring us back to that remembering, putting the pieces back together of who we are and the context that we're in. Exciting things are that we've now created a DMX controller interface, and DMX controllers drive 95% of lights at big events. So we can have the lighting systems of events being responsive to the field of consciousness of the people who are there. He's working with an artist who's come up with this concept of technoetic art. Technoetic art. So this art piece will only come into form in relationship to the person who's looking at it. So the consciousness of the person looking at the art form will what will inform the emergence of it'll be digital art, right, of that digital art form. Or even let's say one of the big tech camps at Burning Man, they've asked us to light this kind of big neon balloon that they have and drive it with the weird tech. So the consciousness tech will be reflecting the consciousness of the people in that camp up on this big kind of lit up neon balloon. So there's a lot of fun to be had with all of that, but it has a fundamentally important message through the experience, really, which is this kind of, oh yeah, there's this field that connects us all, and something that our Western physics is struggling to explain until you drop into the quantum world more and look at the implications of it from that perspective. But we tend to think of it as quantum as purely like particles and little stuff, and forget that actually it's kind of fractal through all different dimensions. And so the world responds. So our interaction with the field of consciousness, is something that can be light can be shed on it from that perspective. And we have found a model that seems to explain it well, called the model of pragmatic information. That comes out of generalized quantum theory. On the goweird.org website, there's a blog and there's a bunch of articles there kind of explaining more about all of this. But yeah, I mean, that's where we are now. So we've kind of created these prototypes. Some of these lights are out there in the world. Some of these weirdoscopes, as we call them, are out there in the world. Various partners wanting to embed it. We're just building a system to be able to have the weird data go to the back end of games. So imagine you're playing League of Legends or World of Warcraft or something. You cast your spell. Imagine that the power of your spell will be related to the coherence of your inner state.
Mm.
maybe that's how the original like wizards, used to do things. But it'll direct people's attention, to their interiors, and that's what's really important, I think, at this time.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like the flip point I see for most people around me is when they start to attribute a very high level of intelligence to the field they inhabit or the world around them. And they start to actually look for synchronicities and they start to look for environmental feedback. And that shift in perspective starts to get very, very profound. At least it has for me in my own life. I guess really the last question I have, and I know you've done a lot of interesting work on this, is if someone's listening to this and they're like, don't buy it, you know, like this all sounds like an abstract framework about something that isn't happening. And actually, like I look around at the political situation in the world and I see everyone dropping back into red and everything's kind of falling apart. Like you've got some very interesting data to show that this probably is happening at various different country level, and you think it is happening at a global level. Like what have you done there?
Well, I mean, the this is happening is the red blue showing up, because what's happening is we're getting, Don Beck always had this great metaphor of when a system comes under stress, it's like you're holding a balloon and you squeeze it in the middle. You're going to get regression and you're going to get breakthrough.
Yeah.
And so orange green, the kind of strive drive and the postmodern sensitive self systems are under pressure now. So you're squeezing them, and what you're getting is red blue bulge and then kind of yellow turquoise push. And the kind of rise of the populist politicians are to do with the fact that folks who have, who just want things to be ordered and structured and bounded, and kind of have a good strong sense of blue and don't want to deal with all of the complexity and everything that's out there, are feeling not, and understandably not heard, seen, understood by the elite, who've been kind of running around in orange green, and forgetting that there's a mass of the population who operate at earlier value systems, more kind of ethnocentric value systems, and that's not a good or a bad thing. As I said, it's about creating the conditions for those value systems to express themselves healthily. But what politicians have tried to do now is kind of force everybody, to adopt their perspective and their level of complexity. And then when you talk that language at people, they just turn off. They just don't get it. And at some point, when they notice that their lives are being affected by the decisions that are being taken, then when they're disaffected, then they start to look for somebody who will make sense of their world for them. And they don't really care. Remember, blue is take it on faith. This was the value systems that the religions came out of. So if Donald Trump or anybody says anything to somebody who really is a strong follower, they will take it on faith. And so it doesn't matter how true it is from an orange scientific perspective. It's like I follow my leader, and that gives me certainty, and that's what folks are looking for, is that sense of certainty. And so we're seeing that across the board. That's why we're getting these populist politicians coming in. So from a systemic perspective, you can think that what the spiral is doing is it's kind of regressing to reintegrate the red blue energy. So that kind of power driven energy from red, and that get clear on what we're standing for and what our purpose is, blue. It's reintegrating that to enable the shift into yellow turquoise. Because if you think about it, given the state of the planet right now, green is gonna spend way too long sitting around discussing it. Well, there is some urgency to what's happening, and that urgency is going to come from red, that red kind of power energy. Let's get shit done. And then the higher purpose, right, that will pull everybody together with all their diverse views and different ethnic backgrounds and different interests. It's got to be, Don called it a superordinate goal, like an overarching purpose that everybody's going to go, this is worth working on. And if I achieve this, it'll help me be who I am and achieve my goals as well. But this is something we've really got to do. That's blue, right? And we've kind of relativized everything. We've relativized blue out of the world. And yet sometimes, there needs to be a stand taken for, the kind of world we want. And that's going to come out of the blue. So that's why I think what's happening with the spiral is it's a reintegration of the red blue and then a kind of push into the integral and turquoise, because ultimately those are the intelligences we're going to need to deal with the complexity. But it's got to be fueled by that red blue, and this is the thing, it has to be rooted in the fundamental value systems of instinctive interconnectedness, just a knowing of interconnectedness that we split off from beige purple. So from that body based is beige body based, and then that just sense of safety and belonging to a place, that is purple. Um, uh, and that's the feminine, that's the deep kind of the great mother, as it were. Ken Wilber has this lovely quote in Up From Eden where he says, when the great mother is repressed, beige purple, the great goddess is concealed. So the turquoise subtle energy world of the great goddess, we don't get that until we reintegrate our relationship to the great mother, which is the kind of deep feminine of the body, the emotion, and all of that. And that's what I call, so when I said right at the beginning that the most popular blog on my post on my blog is with 168,000 reads, is called The Pain and the Promise. And the pain is that separation, because when we actually go inside and we realize what we've done, like when we really realize that we have kind of forgotten that we're the earth, and yet it's the earth literally is the mother that gave birth to us. And then we realize how we have treated her and how we've treated everybody else in the rest of life. There's a huge amount of pain and a huge amount of trauma that we need to heal. So we need to feel that pain. And this is like Joanna Macy, who I'll mention has just passed, was one of the real pioneers of deep ecology. I worked with her colleague, John Seed. Those processes got you to feel the pain and then feel the reconnection. And that's why I think there's a lot of trauma and healing work going on at the moment, because we have to heal that split. And so the pain, when we deal with that, we then get access to the promise, which is the kind of subtle fields of consciousness. And your light like that.
My light just went, the light on my desk just went bonkers. Yeah.
And all of that. So that's why the pain and the promise, they go hand in hand. It's like evolution theory. I kind of talk about it's like a tree. If you want to send your branches higher, bring in more light, access more light, you've got to send your roots deeper, or else you fall over. And sending the roots deeper is into the grunge, it's into the shadow, because that's where the energy is. Actually send the roots deeper to access the water table, access the energy, nutrients you need to be able to grow your branches higher. And a tree, a seed doesn't grow from here like this. Seed grows like this. And that, the roots and the shoots at the same time. And that's kind of, we stretch up for more light, but the brighter the light, the clearer the shadow. So more light, more shadow, more integration, but more energy, therefore, to be able to take the step we need to take. So yeah, that's kind of what's going on, I think, at the moment. So hang on in there, I'd say. Hang on in there, everyone, and be compassionate to yourself and everybody else. Draw boundaries, where you need to. But just notice what's happening, just notice it from that perspective.
Yeah, you made me think of the Carl Jung quote. I think no tree's branches can grow to heaven unless its roots grow to hell.
Oh, really? I hadn't heard that one. Nice one. Yeah, I was going to use that.
I think that's a great place to start. But you mentioned the article with the huge number of views. I will link to that in the show notes. But where else can we find your work?
Best place to go is petermerry.org. And there's I've been running this blog for 20 years or something. And I always try to, I swing between practicing and teaching. I always try to share what I'm learning as I'm going. So having played all these different roles and everything else, I then get into a reflective stage, and I write loads of stuff. So hence the books and everything that's on the blog. But it's a dance between reflection and action, I think, the whole time. Yeah.
That's what we're trying to. Peter Merry, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Tom.